the social chapter that you mentioned briefly earlier on, in Britain, a lot of the trade union movement take a pro-Europe position, and yet the root of it is because they want to get the advances for working class people here in Scotland that were fought for by the French working class, the German trade union movement, the Belgian trade union movement, that are a damn sight stronger than the leadership we have here in Britain. But they stood up and fought, that's why they won. Whereas the trade union movement in Britain tend to be that bit lazier and say, well, can we get what they want, but we don't want to have to struggle for it, go and strike for it, agitate, kick Labour up the backside, you know what I mean? So I look across Europe, and you mentioned before Thatcher, Reagan, others, in Britain, a lot of the progressive social chapters were won by working class people in other parts of Europe, pushing the agenda to the left. In truth, Britain has played far too small a part in that. We've contributed far too little to the social progress in Europe and far too much towards the neoliberal finance capital city of London character that is the European Union today. So that's a lesson we've got to take on board here, that working people in Britain and the progressive socialist movement in Britain have a great deal more to do, even to catch up with what's been achieved by our European counterparts in those countries that I've mentioned,
Yeah, and just to finish up, I'll put you on this spot here. I think we're both people that like talking about the ones that you're not supposed to talk about. So, IndyRef 2 is the unmentionable here. So, if there is a UK referendum and England votes to leave the European Union and Scotland votes to stay in the European Union, is that a case for IndyRef 2?
My categoric answer is yes, it is, because it's a qualitative difference to IndyRef 1, isn't it? I mean, I should say, I think the way the general election is going here in Britain, I don't think there'll be a referendum, because, as you know, Labour and the Liberals and the SNP, who are, I think, more likely to form a government one way or another over the next couple of weeks than the Tories and UKIP and the Liberals. But those three parties' argument is that a referendum in Europe isn't a priority. In fact, it's a distraction. And therefore, they're hardly likely to come forward with one. And I have to say, on top of that, even if there was one, I don't believe there would be a majority for leaving. But to answer your question, in the circumstances, the hypothesis you posed, if there was a referendum, and if England did vote to leave by majority, and Scotland voted to stay in the European Union, then I think it's entirely legitimate for us on the yes side to say, hold on, that's a qualitatively different facet of the referendum we had in September 2014. We're entitled to have another one because the majority in Scotland isn't Little Englander. It's not for casting off our ties with Europe. It's for enhancing the social democratic epicentre. Do you know what I mean? So that would be the answer I would give you, Michael. Not trying to duck the question, I would say, yes, it does offer us the opportunity for a second referendum. But I have to say, as partisans as we both are, I only want to have the referendum when I'm confident that we're going to win it, because a second lost referendum doesn't be a thinking about. So my attitude is I want a second referendum, and I want to be clear that we're going to win it. And I think the circumstances have to be different from those that were in existence in September 2014 for it to be legitimate and democratic and supported by the majority of the population.
Well, to finish off where we come in, I think given that position about being partisans and making sure we're going to win it, I think basically all of our efforts should go to keeping Jim Murphy in charge of Labour.
I'm not sure that's in our hands. This time next week, if the polls that came out today, believe it or not, suggested that Labour would not win a single seat in Scotland, so you can imagine all the stand-up comedians at this year's Edinburgh Festival saying, there are two giant pandas almost extinct, but there are more giant pandas in Edinburgh or in Scotland or in Britain, in fact, than there are Scottish Labour MPs. So I would have thought that Jim Murphy's days are probably numbered anyway. So I don't know who'll be leading the No campaign in future, but I think they've paid a terrible price, Labour, haven't they? An historically unprecedented price for the role that they played in that referendum. That I think that's more likely, that Jim Murphy's probably toast by this time next week.
And also for people who hope for real change across a number of issues, it goes to show you just how quickly things can really turn around very, very sharpish.
Yeah, it's the unpredictable nature of politics. I mean, this is the this is the gift that keeps on giving. You know, the amount of people I meet who'll say, remember 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, they would say, Colin, nobody's interested in politics. More people voted in the Big Brother to eject Jimmy or Wilma, whoever her name was, than participated in the 2010 general election. Nobody comes to public meetings. All of a sudden, that argument's not one you heard before. More often, you hear people saying, I had no idea politics could be so exciting, so much fun, so energising, so full of life, so vital. You know, there's a thirst and an appetite for participation, but a thirst and an appetite for discussion, for learning, for investigating and for research. My goodness me, we've unleashed something extraordinary in Scotland. And again, it's one of the most politicised countries in the world. I don't say that out of a sense of chauvinism. I say that out of a sense of a daily experience where people are talking about, they were talking about the currency this time last year, talking about all sorts of things to do with self-determination. And now they're talking about full fiscal responsibility, the Smith Commission, how we have to move on with the powers of the Scottish Parliament to greater powers. They'll tell you about all the powers that are inherent within full fiscal responsibility that are not sufficient, etc. There's a fantastic appetite for politics, and my view as a socialist is, long may it continue. The more politically aware working class people are, the more I like it, and the more likely, in my view, they are going to not just participate in politics, but they're going to change the world using those ideas as a template.
Thanks very much, Colin.
Brilliant. Always a pleasure, Michael. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Always a pleasure as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Take care. Bye-bye.
So there you go. That was a couple of different interviews from the left-wing perspective on staying in or leaving the European Union. I'm pretty sure that what you heard today is vastly different from the things you're going to be hearing in the coming months and years in the run-up to the EU referendum. So, with regards to the show, now that the wedding and all that's over, I'm sure I have a lot more time to get back to recording interviews and getting the podcast out on a more regular basis. So, it shouldn't be too long, and I'll speak to you next time.